Most criminals leave behind chaos, violence, headlines, a trail of bodies that tells you exactly who they were. But some criminals leave behind something else. Systems, structures so carefully built, they continue working long after the man himself disappears. Meyer Lansky was one of those men. He didn't carry out hits, he didn't crave attention, and he didn't look like a gangster. But behind the scenes, he helped build one of the most powerful criminal empires in modern history. And he did it not with guns, but with numbers. Welcome to the Doc Does Financial History, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Meyer Lansky wasn't born into power. He was born in 1902 in Grodno, in what is now Belarus, then part of the Russian Empire. His family was Jewish, living under constant threat of persecution. Like many others at the time, they immigrated to the United States in search of safety and opportunity, arriving in New York City when Lansky was still a child. They settled in the Lower East Side. At the time, it was one of the most densely populated immigrant neighborhoods in the world. Life there was harsh. Families lived in cramped apartments. Jobs were scarce. Survival often required bending the rules. For many young men growing up in that environment, crime wasn't a dramatic choice. It was a practical one. Lansky entered that world early, but he didn't stand out because of strength or violence. He stood out because he understood something most others didn't. Money isn't just earned, it's managed. He had a natural ability with numbers. He could track transactions in his head, calculate risks quickly, and most importantly, he understood how systems worked. While others focused on short-term gains, Lansky thought long-term. That difference would define his entire career. One of the earliest and most important relationships he formed was with Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. The two met as teenagers. They couldn't have been more different. Siegel was aggressive, impulsive, and driven by ego. Lansky was calm, calculating, and controlled. But together, they formed a powerful partnership, muscle and mind. As their operations expanded, Lansky became involved with a broader network of organized crime figures, including Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano would go on to restructure the American Mafia into a more organized system, often referred to as the National Crime Syndicate. And Lansky played a key role behind the scenes, not as a leader in the traditional sense, but as the man who made the system function. The turning point came with Prohibition. In 1920, the United States banned the production and sale of alcohol. But demand didn't disappear. It exploded. Suddenly, there was enormous money to be made in supplying something that people still wanted but could no longer legally buy. Bootlegging became one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in American history. But it wasn't simple. It required supply chains, distribution networks, bribery of officials, and coordination across cities. This wasn't street crime anymore. It was logistics, and that's where Lansky thrived. While others fought over territory, Lansky focused on organization. He helped structure operations, track profits, and ensure money moved efficiently between different groups. He understood something critical. Crime could be chaotic, or it could be run like a business. When Prohibition ended in 1933, many criminal organizations struggled. Their primary source of income vanished almost overnight. But Lansky had already prepared for that shift. He moved into gambling, not small operations, but large-scale, highly organized systems that generated consistent revenue. Casinos, betting operations, and international ventures became the new focus. And once again, Lansky approached it with discipline, controlled risk, predictable returns, structured growth. One of his most ambitious moves was expanding into Cuba. In the 1940s and 1950s, Havana became a major destination for American tourists. Gambling, nightlife, and luxury created an environment where money flowed freely. Lansky saw the opportunity immediately. Working with Cuban leader Fulgencio Batista, Lansky helped develop casinos and entertainment venues that catered to wealthy visitors from the United States. These weren't small operations. They were large, profitable, and carefully managed. And behind them all was a financial system designed to move money quietly. This is where Lansky truly earned the title. The mob's accountant. He wasn't just tracking money, he was protecting it. Illegal profits couldn't simply be stored in obvious places. They needed to be hidden, moved, and cleaned. And Lansky became one of the first figures in organized crime to use complex financial strategies to do exactly that. He used offshore accounts, shell corporations, layered transactions designed to make tracing money nearly impossible. At a time when financial oversight was limited, this gave him a massive advantage. Because while others focused on earning money, Lansky focused on making it disappear. And in that world, invisibility is power. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Lansky avoided unnecessary attention. He didn't flaunt wealth in public. He didn't seek media attention. And he avoided violence whenever possible. Not because he was moral, but because he was strategic. Violence attracts attention. Attention attracts investigation. An investigation threatens the system. That discipline allowed him to survive longer than many others in organized crime. Figures who relied on force often met violent ends or long prison sentences. Lansky remained quiet, controlled, and always calculating. But even the most carefully built systems faced disruption. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution changed everything. Fidel Castro came to power and quickly shut down the casino industry that Lansky had helped build. Foreign criminal operations were expelled. Years of investment disappeared almost instantly. For many, this would have been the end. But Lansky adapted. He shifted operations, explored new opportunities, and continued managing financial networks elsewhere. Because his power was never tied to a single location. It was tied to knowledge. As law enforcement evolved in the 1960s and 1970s, authorities began focusing more on financial crimes. This posed a new kind of threat. Because Lansky's entire operation was built on financial systems, he became the subject of multiple investigations, charged with tax evasion, linked to organized crime networks. At one point, he attempted to move to Israel, hoping to avoid prosecution. But he was denied permanent residency and forced to return to the United States. Despite decades of involvement in organized crime, Lansky was never convicted of crimes that fully reflected his influence. Which raises an interesting question. Was he simply lucky, or was he just that careful? When he died in 1983, reports suggested he left behind surprisingly modest wealth. Far less than many expected. Some believe he had hidden assets that were never found. Others argued that his real power was never about personal wealth. It was about control. Because Lansky didn't just make money. He built systems that made money. And that may be his most important legacy. He helped transform organized crime from fragmented groups into structured enterprises. He introduced financial discipline, strategic planning, long-term thinking. He turned crime into something that resembled legitimate business. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because when you strip away legality, the structure starts to look surprisingly familiar. Systems that appear completely different on the surface often share the same foundations underneath. Both rely on organization. Both require a network of people who know their roles and play them well. And most importantly, both depend on trust, the kind that keeps everything running smoothly, even when millions are moving silently in the background. At the core, it's about control. Managing money efficiently, moving it without friction, ensuring it reaches the right places at the right time. Whether it's a legitimate enterprise or something operating in the shadows, the mechanics can feel almost identical. The real difference isn't always in how these systems function. Sometimes, it comes down to one simple factor: what the law permits and what it forbids. The line between legal and illegal can be thinner than most people think, often defined by regulation rather than structure. That's exactly what figures like Lansky understood better than anyone. He didn't chase attention or public recognition. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. Instead, he focused on building something far more powerful: the system itself. Quietly, carefully, with precision, he created networks that could operate seamlessly, structures that didn't rely on visibility but on efficiency. While others sought power through presence, he secured it through control behind the scenes. Because in the end, the most influential people aren't always the ones making noise. They're the ones who understand how everything connects. The ones who study the system, learn its weaknesses, and figure out how to shape it without ever stepping into the spotlight. If you truly want to understand how power works, don't just follow what's visible. Look deeper, follow the patterns, follow the systems, and above all, follow the money.